brought the culture of New Orleans to MBL every year by providing king cakes to select offices in Woods Hole and Falmouth, and everybody misses that and misses him for that. Looking into the future of libraries, such as our MBL Lou Hui Library here, the Mizell family funded the development of science history exhibition spaces here, which are seen and used by hundreds of students in Woods Hole every year. Michael earned his BA in Classics, a master's degree in English literature, and a doctoral degree in history, all from Tulane University. He was the founding editor of the Hurricane Rita and Katrina Digital Memory Bank, a multi-institutional digital collaboration which captured, through the participation of citizens, the content and context and inequities of that difficult time. He also produced important documentaries illuminating race history in New Orleans, and one was shown on PBS called Streetcar Stories, and another one was the history of the poor boy sandwich, which encapsulated the history of the labor movement in New Orleans. This pandemic, which we are now emerging from, is the type of experience which one cannot live through without thinking of forward-minded, transformative educators like Michael Mizell, who would have been at the forefront of responding to and documenting American life in these times. The Falmouth Public Library did work with the community to document the impact of the pandemic on people's lives in the last couple of years. Linda Collins has been at Falmouth Public Library since 2012, coming here from the Lamont and Wiedner Libraries at Harvard University. One of Linda's significant accomplishments since coming to Falmouth has been the preservation of the cultural history of Falmouth through the digitization of the Falmouth Enterprise newspaper, and she strongly supported legislation by State Representative David Vieira to allow State Community Preservation Act funding to be used for the digitization of historic documents and community newspapers in Massachusetts. Linda has also preserved and placed on view town-owned art collections and has illuminated Falmouth's past as one of the first summer resorts in New England through the digitization and of public programs about the local historical postcard collections through a grant from the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners. It's an honor for me to introduce to you Linda Collins, Director of the Falmouth Public Library.
So we're all here tonight to hear from Robert Darnton. Robert Darnton is a cultural historian who specializes in 18th century France. He was a student at Phillips Academy and did his undergraduate work at Harvard. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and earned his PhD in history while there. He spent his academic career as a member of the faculty at Princeton, and in 2007, he became the Carl H. Pforzheimer University Professor and Harvard University Librarian. Among his honors, he was a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship. He was named a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor. In 2012, he was presented with a National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama. And in 2013, he received the Del Duca World Prize in Humanities from the Institut de France. Professor Darnton has authored over a dozen books, including The Great Cat Massacre and Other Episodes in French Cultural History, which was translated into 18 languages. Bob has told me that this was clearly the best book title he came up with, but I'm also intrigued by The Devil in the Holy Water, The Art of Slander from Louis XIV to Napoleon. A huge contribution to scholarship is Bob's work on the Digital Public Library of America, a nonprofit that connects people to libraries, archives, museums, and other cultural heritage institutions. The power of this project is to provide broad access to resources to increase contributions to scholarship by removing geographic and economic limitations. I'm happy to report that Kim DeWall of the Falmouth Public Library was in the first class of the DPLA Community Reps, a group who engaged their communities by leading DPL outreach activities. Bob was a notable pioneer in the study of the history of the book and was the director of Princeton's Center for the Study of Books. Tonight, Bob is going to talk to us about all the books in the world, the art of the libraries of antiquity in the future. We are in for a real treat. Please join me in welcoming Robert Darnton.
Thank you, Linda. Well, I am delighted to be here. I want to thank, of course, the Marine Biological Laboratory and the Falmouth Forum for inviting me. It's a treat to be here in this great center for science, which also makes room for the humanities, which is the little corner I inhabit in my own life. I thank you, Linda, for the generous introduction. And I would like to pay tribute to Michael Mizell and to thank his family too. Furthermore, welcome to the online audience for this talk. I don't know where you are or how many you are, but you're very welcome to tune in. What I want to discuss is a rather large subject, all the books in the world. It is, of course, a utopian dream, and it's one that dates from the ancient Library of Alexandria. But instead of plunging into that utopia, what I would like to begin with a rather negative note, which comes from one of my favorite writers, Jorge Luis Borges. He was, as I'm sure you know, a great book lover. He was also a librarian as well as a great writer. And Borges warns us, though, much as he loved books, to beware of this ambition, all the books in the world. In one of his stories, a character remarks, the great successors to the Library of Alexandria should be burned once every 400 years. And in another story, he talks about a book made out of sand that contained all of the books in the world. One of the characters manages to get it in his possession, and he's thrilled that he has everything between two covers, but then he finds he can't bear the burden of all that bookishness, and he hides it in the stacks of the National Library of Buenos Aires. In a third story, which you probably know, the Library of Babylon, Borges talks about an imaginary library that did contain not only all the books in the world, but every possible combination of all the letters in the alphabet. Everyone inhabits this library, which is a metaphor for life, of course, but they too find it unbearable. So Borges warns us utopias can turn into dystopias, and we should be careful. Well, despite Borges, we librarians still want to give readers access to all the books in the world, even if somehow that ambition could lead to disasters. And so I want to remind you about the disaster of the Library of Alexandria as well as its glory. It calls up in its popular version a romantic vision, the greatest library that ever was, all knowledge from antiquity packed into one palatial space, and then a tragic ending, a fire set by none other than Julius Caesar. Trapped in Alexandria by a superior force, Caesar had arrived with a small army and a fleet trying to settle a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. He found that he was surrounded by a superior force. They were about to overwhelm him in the center of the city, and so he burned his ships as a strategy, a ploy to prevent the final assault while reinforcements were coming to save him. And that destroyed the library. So Hellenic culture went up in flames. Many of the greatest works of philosophy and literature were irreparably lost. And from that conflagration, only the ashes remained, and today we can't even locate the site where the great library stood. Well, that version of events is wrong. But it is actually a compelling vision. It can be taken as a legend, or if you like, a cautionary tale about the history of libraries and their role in shaping the world of knowledge. So the legend has actually two sides, one positive, one negative. On the bright side, it represents the aspiration to bring together all knowledge in a way that will make it accessible to all humanity. On the dark side, its destruction feeds into lamentations about cultural catastrophe. For example, because we've heard of a lot of these lamentations recently, the notion that the book is dead. Of course, that's utterly false. People have done more reading in the last COVID year and a half than they had before, and the publication of books in print as well as books online is going up. A second lamentation you hear is libraries are obsolete. That's nonsense. You have a great library here, which I've just visited. It gets lots of use. And we found, for example, that the New York Public Library is more used and in more different ways than ever. So I would say libraries are actually prospering. Still, these views, which I call lamentations, are in their own way revealing as a kind of legend. I think that a history of cultural Jeremiads, if it could ever be put together, would expose the unease of intellectuals faced with change in the means of communication. In 1928, Walter Benjamin, a great hero for college students today, declared, I quote, "Everything indicates that the book is nearing its end," end quote. That's 1928. And at about the same time, Ezra Pound prophesied, quote, "The art of letters will come to an end before AD 2000," end quote. One of the great Shakespearean scholars of our time, Alvin Kernan, devoted an entire book to what was titled The Death of Literature. So we are hearing prophecies of doom that can be detected far back into the past, along with other symptoms of disorientation, such as information overload. Actually, the suffering from information overload it was something that scholars in the 16th century complained about all the time when the very word information was invented. So we're dealing with a very complicated landscape. On the one hand, this great ambition to make knowledge accessible. On the other, lamentations about its decline. Historians often play tricks on their readers by finding continuity where most of us think there is change. So I think we should beware of a misplaced sense of continuity that can actually blunt our understanding of cultural changes in the information environment. In fact, if you take a very long view of the history of the technology of what led to the book, there are only, at least in my view, 4 great turning points. The first occurred in 4000 BC with the invention of writing. The second in about 2000 BC, these are long time periods, with the invention of writing with alphabetical letters. The third in about, 200 AD, the invention of the codex, that is a book that you could read by turning pages, as opposed to the volumen, a book that you had to unscroll in order to read. And then the 1450s, the invention or reinvention of printing with movable type. I just mentioned that, you might not agree, but I think you can look at these technological changes, and what strikes you is how long it took for them to happen. We're talking about long time periods of 1,000, 2,000 years until the recent past. It's only recently that the pace of change has changed in a way that is truly staggering. The internet, 1974. The World Wide Web, 1991. And then one breakthrough after another. Search engines, algorithmic relevance ranking, smartphones, and social media. All of this has happened within our own lifetimes. So in contrast to this very long period of big technological breakthroughs, we suddenly had a revolutionary series of them. And I think we are living in a world where the revolution is greater than that produced by Gutenberg. So what I think we need to do is to get some sense of change and to ask whether the Library of Alexandria should be considered as a turning point in this general scheme that has to do with technology, the technology of information. And the answer I would suggest is no. The library's holdings consisted almost entirely of papyrus rolls or scrolls, and the library contributed nothing or little to the most important technological change of that time. That is, the shift I mentioned from the volumen or books in rolls, which you had to unroll to read, to the codex, which was an incredibly important invention, books that you could, that were in pages that you could turn. Your frame of perception was entirely different, and this turned out to be one of the great inventions of all time, but it did not happen at the Library of Alexandria. And yet that library stands out as a monument in the history of knowledge. Although it came to an unhappy ending, but not Caesar's fire. And although it left little evidence of its existence, it actually began as a breathtakingly ambitious attempt by the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt to collect and preserve everything known to humankind. I just should remark, but probably you're familiar with the background, that one of the greatest things about Alexander the Great was his education and his commitment to learning. For several years, from the age of 13, he was tutored by Aristotle. And there is some evidence, although it's dubious, that Aristotle's Lyceum and Aristotle's personal library served as the foundation for the Library of Alexandria. In any case, after succeeding to the Macedonian throne at age 20, Alexander the Great went on, as you know, to conquer what he thought was the rest of the world, Persia. Then he went deep into India, faced with a danger of a revolt by his soldiers. He came back, and he finally died in Babylon, actually. But his body was taken to Alexandria, the city that Alexander founded, and it's a city that became the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt. It thrived as a commercial center while the floods of the Nile carried fresh silts to the delta area, making it possible for the Egyptians to harvest bountiful crops of grain because Egypt actually became the bread basket of both Greece and Rome. The Ptolemies reigned over Egypt for 300 years. From the beginning, they made the Library of Alexandria the expression of their grandeur. They invested enormous resources into building up its collections, sending out agents to purchase books in every conceivable subject from every imaginable source. According to Galen, the great Greek physician, the kings ordered each ship that docked in Alexandria to be searched for books. If any were found, they were taken to the library and copied by the resident scribes, and then they returned not the originals, but the copies. Galen also reported that the third king of the Ptolemies asked to borrow the original manuscripts of Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides from Athens. The Athenians said, well, okay, but we don't want any more foul play. You will have to leave a large treasure as a guarantee you will return them. So he sent the treasure, they copied the books, and sure enough, they sent the copies back instead of the originals. He said, you could keep all the money I sent to you. So you see, there's a fundamental ambition on the part of the Ptolemaic rulers, and that was to create the greatest library that would, sure enough, acquire all the books in the world. Whereas Alexander had failed to conquer the world, they would become masters of the world of knowledge. That is the Western world, because of course they knew nothing about advances in China and Asia. Now, you could interpret this library policy as a form of what we now call soft power, or even, as one authority put it, cultural imperialism. By collecting all the books in the world, the Ptolemies tried to assert their dominion over classical Greek civilization and other civilizations as well, because the collections contained many books in many languages. The library was meant to last forever, proclaiming the greatness of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was, if you like, their version of the pyramids. Now, that view I must admit, does involve a great deal of speculation because we have little evidence about the actual functioning of that great library. Although it is often mentioned by contemporaries like Plutarch and Galen, it eventually did disappear without leaving a trace of its existence. And much of the research about it, it's a whole industry really of research, concerns the problem of how it disappeared. It probably did suffer somewhat from the fire set by Julius Caesar during his brief conquest of Egypt in 48 to 47 BC. He arrived in Alexandria, as I said, with a small army, trying to resolve this dispute between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. But soon he became entangled both with Cleopatra, who apparently really was irresistible, and with Ptolemy XIII, who lay siege to the city and began to close in on Caesar's forces, which were located in the center of the city near the great library. So before the reinforcements could arrive, Caesar stopped him by a tactical maneuver, which involved burning the Roman fleet. Now, the fire may have reached the smaller so-called daughter library of the Serapeum, but the main library was spared. Now, there are many references to its existence after Caesar's expedition, which ended after his victory in the fierce Roman-Egyptian Battle of the Nile. He restored Cleopatra to the throne with her other brother, who became Ptolemy XIV. Her next lover, Mark Antony, reportedly offered to compensate her for the loss of some of the books in the fire by giving her the 200,000 works from the rival library of Pergamon, but that too seems doubtful. Still, it illustrates the importance of a point I'm trying to make. Books as trophies in the high stakes of politics in the 1st century BC. Now, I won't go into those politics, but I should recall that in the struggle between Octavian and Antony, linked with Cleopatra, for the domination of the Roman Republic, Antony, as you know, lost. After his defeat in the Battle of Actium, 31 BC, he and Cleopatra separately committed suicide. Octavian, triumphant, incorporated Egypt as a province of the Roman Empire and became the first emperor under the name of Augustus in 27 BC. That marked the end of the Roman Republic and of Ptolemaic rule in Egypt, but not the end of the library. Augustus appointed a new head librarian in Alexandria, and the great library remained intact, well used, although it got less and less funding as the centuries went on. Its demise probably occurred 2 centuries later, in 272 AD, during a civil war, which destroyed the central area where it was located in the city of Alexandria. Reports by later travelers indicate that nothing remained but ruins by the end of the 4th century AD. That is, long before the conquest of Egypt by Arab Muslim warriors in 641 to 42. So we can't blame the Arabs for it. In fact, all the books had disappeared 2 centuries before the Muslims arrived, and we don't know exactly what happened to them, but they were probably dispersed or lost. What little we know comes primarily from references in notes made by monks when they made copies of classical texts during the Middle Ages. A great deal of our knowledge about classical antiquity comes, therefore, indirectly from the library. In the case of Euripides, for example, contemporary evidence shows that he wrote 92 or maybe 95 plays. All of them almost certainly were included in the great Library of Alexandria, yet only 18 have survived in their entirety. So yes, the loss of the library was a catastrophe, even though it did not happen all at once in one great bonfire. Still, the library had quite a run of it. It lasted 600 years, making its collections available to visiting scholars and dominating the world of knowledge throughout the Hellenistic age. Quite a record when compared with modern libraries. The Library of Congress, for example, really was burned down, as you know, by British troops in 1812. It revived thanks to the acquisition of Jefferson's library, but it's only 231 years old, and it does not pretend to contain most existing books, although it does claim to be the largest library in the world. Now, that, I hope, gives you some sense of what little we know about the greatest library of antiquity, but what about its functioning? How did it actually operate? Well, we don't know much about that either. That is, what its layout was, how its internal organization operated. But various sources indicate that it was the main ingredient of a mausoleum, or museum, a combined school and research located near the royal palace in Alexandria, in the heart of the city. And the name museum, as in British museum, evoked its dedication to the muses, whom it honored with a shrine. So there's a religious component to it also. It had a storage hall with shelves for its gigantic collection of scrolls, but no central reading room. Readers probably fetched scrolls from the hall and read them in nearby passages and small rooms. It was not a public library. Far from admitting ordinary subjects of the king, the library and the museum as a whole served as something you could call an institute for advanced study, rather like the institute right here. It made room for 30 to 50 resident scholars and researchers who received salaries, were given tax exemptions, and free board and lodging. They took meals together in a common dining room. They occasionally gave lectures, taught classes, or directed symposia, because the museum did have a pedagogical component, just as you do here in doing your research. It included dinner discussions attended by the king and other members of the royal household. The head librarian, a scholar appointed by the king, served as tutor to the heir to the throne and also as a priest at the shrine of the muses. Colonnades, porticos, covered walkways, and a garden provided a setting for peripatetic discussion in the style of Aristotle's Lyceum and Plato's Academy. There may even have been a zoo, as some of the Ptolemies had a great interest in zoology. One resident scholar, Callimachus, created the first comprehensive catalog of Greek literature, organized by genre and the alphabetical order of authors' names. Whether it determined the actual organization of the collections in the library, we don't know. But a catalog was required to integrate acquisitions and to locate material. Galen indicates that when books arrived, they had elaborate labels that described their original owners and where they came from. So it seems possible that this catalog, I mean, it's quite something. The first catalog we know contained information that we would call metadata today. The collection was gigantic. Estimates vary, but certainly it contained 400,000 scrolls, and some estimates put the total number at 700,000. It covered the entirety of classical Greek literature, philosophy, and science, along with a great many foreign works, which were translated into Greek by the scholars of the museum. So, I mean, it was an elaborate, very ambitious enterprise. The scholars included poets and scientists, as well as specialists in literature and philosophy. Two of the greatest mathematicians, Euclid and Archimedes, probably spent some time as fellows in the museum. The third head librarian, Aristophanes, applied mathematics to geography and map making and actually calculated the circumference of the Earth with nearly correct precision. Most of the scholars transcribed and edited texts, concentrating on the Greek classics, which the library collected in many different versions. Apparently, they enjoyed a pleasant, well-subsidized life, at least during the early years of the library, when funds flowed freely. They were said to consume a good deal of alcohol, and they organized games and festivities among themselves. I don't know if the scientists here play a lot of games, but certainly there were good times in ancient Alexandria, and occasionally they misbehaved. One of them, Sotades of Baronea, wrote an off-colored poem about the marriage of Ptolemy II to his sister. He was put in a lead jar and dropped into the ocean. The library's prestige and intellectual power made it the dominant institution in the world of knowledge during the Hellenistic era. Inevitably, it aroused the jealousy of wits and sophists outside Alexandria. One of them, Timon of Philus, delivered an acid academic one-liner, quote, "In populous Egypt, many cloistered bookworms are fed, arguing endlessly in the chicken coop of the muses," end quote. So that's how academics talked about each other at the time of the great Library of Alexandria. Now, does this story yield any fresh conclusions? I mean, I'm trying to summarize a lot of scholarship and to give you some sense of what we can actually know about the great Library of Alexandria. Well, from the perspective of library history, I think 2 points stand out. First, the Library of Alexandria represents the culmination of a shift in antiquity from a kind of literature based on oral transmission, as in the Homeric epics, to one based on script. Written literature flourished as never before in Augustan Rome, which had a lively book trade and at least 24 libraries. Yet rhetoric did continue to be a fundamental aspect of public life, and orators still memorized speeches or declaimed them from wax tablets in which words were run together without spacing in order to bring out their resonance rather than their meaning as isolated units. So that's how Cicero, for example, prepared his orations. The Library of Alexandria Alexandria represented a break from that rhetorical tradition. That's because its scholars reworked the Greek classics by copying, correcting, collating, editing, and writing commentaries on them. Zenodotus, the first head librarian in Alexandria, was also the first to edit Homer's epics. And in collating the texts, he divided them into books or chapters, adapting them to the eye rather than to the ear. Although these scholars did not produce any technological innovations, as I said, they repossessed the past by transforming it into a script-based culture. The second point I want to make is that, of course, the library expressed the ambition to bring all knowledge together, and by doing so, to exert mastery over everything known. That ambition is still with us. But it did not actually originate in Alexandria. In 1849, archaeologists discovered a collection of 30,000 cuneiform clay tablets at Nineveh in northern Iraq. The tablets were assembled by Assurbanipal, an Assyrian king, he was from 668 to 627 BC, and he's now famous among library historians. He's celebrated as the creator of what some call the first systematically collected library, or even the first national library in the Western world. But he wasn't. More recent excavations in Uruk, in southern Iraq, have turned up the oldest written documents, 4,500 tablets found anywhere in the world, including all of Asia. They date from sometime between 3,400 and 3,000 BC, soon after the invention of writing. They were word lists, essentially accounts used to keep track of objects and possessions, and they were curated and archived. That is, they belonged to something that could be considered a library. By 2900 BC, Europe had developed into an important city, the largest in the world, with at least 50,000 residents. It produced what some consider as the first great work of literature, the epic Gilgamesh, which dates in its earliest version from 2100 BC. So the history of libraries goes back 5,000 years. It is congruent with the history of literature and of writing itself. The Library of Alexandria was a late comer in this history, and it expressed an ancient ambition to gain mastery over the world by collecting everything knowable in the form of writing. Well, I'm going to take a great leap into the present and the future because we are still at it. As you know, in 2004, Google set out to digitize all the books in the world. It began at Harvard, and we gave it access to our collections, the largest of any university library in the world. But then Google came back and said, and by the way, we would also like to digitize your books that are covered by copyright. At that point, we said no. But the University of Michigan, Stanford, the universities of California said yes. So Google began actually digitizing books that were not in the public domain. And it was instantly sued by the Association of American Publishers and the Authors Guild. Then the plaintiffs and Google went into secret negotiations trying to reach a settlement. That lasted 3 years. And when they came out with this document, a very complex, thick document called The Settlement, we discovered that they had transformed the original idea, which actually was a search service, a very good idea, in my opinion, because it would have given readers access to information they wanted with indications of where they could look it up in books, and many times with the address of the nearest library where they could find the books. So the original idea of a search service was transformed by the settlement into something very different, namely a commercial library, which would contain all the books in the world. Now, this settlement seemed to some of us like a not very good idea, because Google was really asking us, because its main customers would be libraries, to buy back our own books in digital form at a price that would be set by Google, and that without consulting the public in any way at all, because the public's interest was not consulted. So it's a long story. There were a lot of polemics. I got very involved in it. And finally, the Federal District Court for the Southern District of New York said Google book search, as it was called, is illegal. And so Google book search is dead. You can get books through Google, of course, but they sell them to you with the permission of the publishers. Now, in some ways, you could argue that Google book search was, like the Library of Alexandria, a great idea, and even an inspiring example. Before it was discovered and declared illegal, it raised a question. Would it not be possible to create a non-commercial library devoted to the public good by linking all the digitized holdings in all the major libraries of America? That principle is known as open access, but it goes back long before the internet. In the United States, it was recognized with the founding of the first major public library in 1848 in Boston. And you can see this carved over the entrance to the Boston Public Library, quote, free access to all. So that principle of free access has been with us a long time. On October 1st, 2010, I invited a group of leaders from foundations, libraries, and computer science to meet at Harvard and discuss the possibility of applying that principle, open access, to create a digital public library of America. And we set to work devising a technical infrastructure, a network of contributing libraries, and an administrative center where John Palfrey, who was here just a few weeks ago, was the leader. On April 18th, 2013, the DPLA was launched. Its collections now contain 35 million books and other objects. They come from 4,300 institutions located in all 50 states, and they are being used free of charge by readers all over the world, except in one country, North Korea. Now, there are similar projects also at work with the same goal of public access. I have time to mention only 4. One is in Alexandria itself, the Bibliotheca Alexandria. It is a superb cultural center completed in 2002, which has a library with 1 million printed books, and links to the Internet Archive in San Francisco. It began as a project to build a library for the University of Alexandria. Then it won the support of the Egyptian government and of UNESCO, which sponsored it as a kind of modern reincarnation of the ancient Library of Alexandria, and of its mission to include all of human knowledge. But of course, it does not have the resources to do so. It collects works only in Arabic, French, and English, and it has been criticized as a vanity project used to make the Egyptian government look progressive, even though that government does not provide enough funds to sustain it. But it's a magnificent complex of buildings, which includes some important museums. Secondly, there is HathiTrust. It's a digital repository in Michigan that contains material from more than 60 research libraries and provides free access to 5.3 million books, all of them in the public domain. HathiTrust actually began as a collective attempt to solve the problem of preserving digital works. And I think it has great possibilities for also diffusing them. Third, the Internet Archive. It's a gigantic digital lending library created by Brewster Kahle. He is an extraordinary computer scientist from MIT who built many inventions, created digital companies, and then retired to devote himself to open access. His Wayback Machine has crawled the internet and saved 10 million website pages. And then Brewster devised a way to make copyrighted books available for free online. He buys and solicits donations of physical books, digitizes them, and makes the digital versions available, one copy at a time, in the manner of a public lending library. The fourth example is Europeana. It links the digital collections of libraries in all the countries of the European Union. It got off to a strong start, although at first it crashed because everyone wanted to get a copy of the Mona Lisa. It's a great idea. It has, unfortunately, a cumbersome structure, and the EU does not provide adequate financial support, but it is an institution with great potential, and its technical infrastructure is compatible with that of the Digital Public Library of America. Now, all of these enterprises must overcome enormous difficulties, notably in solving problems of preservation and in overcoming the restrictions of copyright, which make most books published since 1923 inaccessible. The public domain is only a fraction of what it should be. But we are making progress. And in 10 years, I believe we will have an open access world digital library, which will eventually include almost all the books in existence. Well, you see, I've switched from an argument about the past to a prediction about the future, which may seem downright utopian. But I would like to close with a conclusion. We have it in our power to realize what was an impossible dream in Alexandria more than 2,000 years ago. Thank you.
We have time for maybe just one question from the audience. Maybe two.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Much to think about, but books seem to be, or written material, or static written material is just one aspect of what information is these days. Videos and even computable documents, and so there's so much more. How does that fit in to your vision?
Well, of course, I take your point. I'm really talking about the history of libraries and the ambition to bring all books together and make them accessible. But there are many other ways of communication. Cavemen were drawing beautiful pictures before the invention of writing. We have endless other means of communication today, with telephones, television, all sorts of means of communication. So I'm not trying to be so ambitious as to sketch in this very fast-moving way, covering thousands of years, the entire history of communication. But books, I think, are still central to our culture, and if we can get an overview of the history of books by taking a look at Alexandria and some of the ancient libraries, and then situating our present ambitions in that context, that's already enough, I hope, to orient us in this new world that has burst upon us within our own lifetimes.
Well, I think take one more question from the audience.
I like triads, so I'd like to ask what your 3 favorite books are.
You must have spent a lot of time in France because, you have to always make 3 points in any talk, and then 3 subpoints to each of the 3 points. I think I would begin with my favorite author, who is Mother Goose. I love Mother Goose rhymes and have read them endlessly to my children and grandchildren. And I actually think that they tell us a lot about the past. We can date some of them and so on. So let me put Mother Goose at the top of my list. Now, the second, well, I've been recently, in the last couple of years, reading everything I could by Borges, and that's why I began by quoting from Borges. And he would give me a hint about a third possibility, which will also surprise you, Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, I like Robert Louis Stevenson, but Borges goes on and on and on about Stevenson as the greatest author in the English language, which is something he actually said. So I haven't answered your question, I've ducked it, but well, I also should admit that during the pandemic, when I got to spend a lot of time at home, I read, and I'm ashamed to admit it, for the first time, War and Peace. And I was overwhelmed. I mean, I've never enjoyed a book so much. I was just swept up in that wonderful vision of that strange world.
Well, I think we can safely conclude by saying, first, please support your local public library. And let's give Professor Darnton a round of applause. Thank you.